She had 14 sets of clean clothes, and not one of the girls would touch them. That was the moment Helen Morris understood that something had gone very wrong inside these women long before the trucks pulled through the gate that morning. Not wrong the way war made things wrong. Something deeper. Something that had been working quietly in the dark during all those weeks of retreat, eating away at the places inside a person where dignity lives, where the small private rituals of womanhood are kept without thought because they have always been available to tend. Helen stood in the processing room of the temporary detention camp in southern France and looked at 14 young German prisoners who would not reach out and take clean clothes being offered to them freely. And she felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with protocol. The room was cold. The 14 sets of clothing lay on the wooden tables in perfect rows, folded with military precision by Corporal Dawes, each bundle exactly 18 inches from the next. Plain cotton dresses, undergarments wrapped in paper, stockings in careful balls, shoes side by side with the laces already threaded. They had come from Red Cross stores and surplus shipments, and were not the clothes any of these girls would have chosen from a shop on a street that still existed. But they were clean. That was supposed to be enough. The girls stood motionless beside the tables with their arms crossed tightly over their chests and their eyes lowered, and their faces so pale and so close that Helen's first instinct was to check whether someone had already told them something that had made the situation worse. She walked the length of the room slowly, watching each face with the careful attention she gave to everything that mattered, the kind of watching that looks like stillness from the outside, but is actually full of motion happening somewhere beneath the surface, a continuous process of reading and cataloging and cross-referencing against everything she already knew. None of them spoke. None of them reached out. Several had their hands pressed flat against their own ribs, as though holding themselves together by sheer force of will, as though without that particular pressure something essential might come loose. Helen recognized that gesture. She had seen it before in women who had been through the kind of long, terrible experience that erases the assumption that you are still permitted to take up space in the world without justification. The assumption that your continued presence is not an imposition. The assumption that what you need is not automatically an inconvenience to someone more deserving of having their needs considered. Corporal Dawes muttered something from the doorway. His voice was pitched low, but not low enough. If they don't want clean clothes, that's their problem. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired man with too many tasks assigned him before lunch, and no particular frame of reference for what he was watching, no category in his operational experience into which it fit neatly. Helen did not answer him. She kept her eyes on the women. It was not defiance. She was certain of that within the first 30 seconds. She had worked with prisoners who were defiant, male and female, soldiers from half a dozen different armies. People who had decided that resistance was the last territory that still belonged to them, and who wore their refusal like armor that had been carefully and deliberately put on. They looked at you with hard, steady eyes and kept their back straight, and dared you to make something of it, and there was a kind of pride in it that you could understand even if you couldn't accommodate it. This was not that. These girls were not refusing out of stubbornness or ideology or pride. They were refusing because they were ashamed. And shame is the quietest and the most durable of all the things that war does to people who were not supposed to be soldiers in the first place, because it does not announce itself, does not come in uniform, does not mark itself on any intake form. It simply settles the way sediment settles in still water, slowly and invisibly and without drama, until the water itself seems different without anyone being able to say precisely when the change occurred or exactly what caused it, and once it is there, it is almost impossible to see past it from the inside. Helen Morris had been in France for 14 months by that October morning. She had come with the Volunteer Nursing Corps in the autumn of the previous year, crossing on a transport ship that smelled of engine oil and institutional food and the specific collective anxiety of 500 people going towards something nobody had completely thought through. She had worked in 4 different camp facilities since arriving, 2 of them under active shelling, one of them in a building that had partly collapsed on one side, and where the medical supplies were stored in what had previously been a bedroom, and where the walls of that bedroom were still covered with the previous occupants' drawings, children's drawings, horses and stick-figure families, and a sun in the upper right corner, with rays emanating from it like the rays in children's drawings. Always do in every country, and every language, and every year. She had tended to men with missing limbs and women with fevers that burned for days, and children carried to the medical tent by strangers because their own parents were no longer available to carry them. She had learned to sleep 4 hours and function on it. She had learned to eat whatever was available and not notice what it was. She had learned to read suffering at a distance, to sense the temperature of a room full of frightened people before a single word was exchanged, to identify the specific quality of the silence and what it required. She had also learned, and this was the thing that took the longest to learn, and that could not be taught directly but only absorbed through repeated exposure to its necessity, that the most dangerous assumption in any form of medicine is the assumption that a person's exterior condition tells you everything about their interior one. The exterior and the interior are connected, obviously, critically, but they are not identical, and in the specific conditions of wartime medicine, the gap between them could be enormous, and the failure to account for that gap could be the thing that made the difference between someone recovering and someone not recovering, between someone finding their way back to themselves and someone staying permanently on the far side of whatever line the experience had drawn across their life. She walked to the nearest girl, young, barely 18 by the look of her, with clipped brown hair that hung in stiff matted knots around a face that had lost whatever softness it had started with. Her coat had once been gray and was now the color of roads in November, dark with damp, stiff with something she did not want to identify at close range. Helen tried her German carefully, with a precision she always brought to the borrowed language, aware that errors in borrowed languages arrive differently than errors in native ones, that a wrong word in your own language is a mistake, but a wrong word in someone else's can be a wound. "You may change now," she said. "These are for you." Nobody moved. Helen leaned closer to the brown-haired girl. The girl's jaw was tight, the muscles along it standing out under the skin. Her eyes were fixed on some point slightly below Helen's collarbone and would not shift. Helen waited. She had learned the particular value of waiting, of not rushing to fill silence with reassurance, of letting the space remain open until the other person decided what to do with it. She waited long enough that Evelyn Price, her second nurse, the woman from Massachusetts who had been with her through 3 of the 4 facilities, and who was as close to a professional equal as Helen had ever worked alongside, shifted her weight subtly and glanced across with a question in her expression. Helen held up one finger. "Wait." Then the brown-haired girl's lips parted and moved. Helen did not catch it. She leaned in further, tilting her head, bringing her ear closer to the girl's mouth. "Say it again," she said, still in German. The girl swallowed. It was the kind of swallow that requires real effort, the kind produced by a throat that is tightened against something pressing upward from below. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a thread of sound, almost below the threshold of hearing in a room that was itself not quiet, where outside sounds filtered into the thin walls and the generous windows, the rumbling of trucks on the camp road, the distant calling of orders across the compound, the ordinary noise of a military facility going about its morning. The words came as though they had been waiting for a long time in a very small space, and had finally been given exactly enough room to emerge. "We are unclean." The room did not go dramatically silent. It was already silent, or close enough to it that the difference was not in volume, but in quality, in the specific texture of the silence that followed those 2 words, which change the way the air in a room changes when something significant has been said, and the room itself seems to absorb it. Evelyn looked up from her clipboard. One of the orderlies near the far wall stopped the motion he had been engaged in. Helen felt the words land somewhere in the center of her chest, and remained there with a particular weight of things that had been said precisely and accurately and cannot be taken back. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the brown-haired girl, and then she looked at the others, moving her gaze from face to face with deliberate slowness. Taking in each expression with the same methodical attention she gave to physical symptoms during intake assessments, looking for what was actually present rather than for what she had expected to find. She saw the same thing in every face, a single thing expressed in 14 different versions according to the specific person wearing it. Not illness, not injury in the physical sense, not the ordinary recognizable misery of the captured and the cold and the hungry. Something that had been done to these girls from the inside, by themselves, by the long months of retreat and collapse and the erosion of every private thing a woman requires simply to remain herself in the most fundamental sense. They had gone without privacy, without mirrors or the most basic tools of self-maintenance. without the unremarkable daily ritual of washing their hair in peace, without hot water available for personal use, without soap that served any purpose other than institutional hygiene, without the 2 minutes alone in a room where nobody was watching and nobody needed anything, and a person could simply inhabit her own body, without it being a matter for military scheduling. Their uniforms had become their skin, and their skin had become their shame, and their shame had become so complete and so deeply embedded that the idea of putting on something clean and fresh while still carrying all of that on the inside felt not like relief, but like an act of bad faith, like wearing a costume over an unwashed body and calling it cleanliness. To dress like a woman who has been cared for, while their hair still held a full inventory of everything they'd been through, every kilometer of retreat through mud and cold, every night in a vehicle or a barn or an open field, every moment of fear and exposure, and the specific humiliation of not being able to attend to yourself in any of the ways you had previously taken entirely for granted would be a lie. And whatever else these girls had lost in the months that brought them here, they had not yet lost a part of themselves that knew the difference between what was true and what was not. Marta was the one who found the words for what the brown-haired girl's 2 words contained. She was a translator attached to the camp that week through an arrangement Helen had not entirely followed but had been grateful for, a displaced schoolteacher from Stuttgart in her mid-50s who wore her gray hair in a bun secured with 2 pins, and her exhaustion with the particular acceptance of someone who had been exhausted for long enough to have made a kind of peace with it. She had been standing near the back of the room listening with the alert stillness of a person who is very good at listening, and she moved forward now and spoke quietly in German to the group of women, and bent her head and listened to what came back to her, and then turned to face Helen and Evelyn. Her expression was doing the complex work of someone who is translating not merely language, but the full atmospheric weight of a human condition for which no clean translation exists. Their hair, Marta said, it carries everything. She paused, assembling for what she had heard the most accurate available version of what was meant. Smoke, lice powder, mud, the smell of hospital corridors. Fear. Another pause. Evelyn said everything very quietly, as a question, trying to understand the full scope of what was being communicated. Marta said yes. Everything they had been through, everything that happened to them and that happened around them, and that they could not stop and could not get away from and could not wash off because there was nowhere to wash, no privacy in which to do it, no moment long enough and safe enough to make the effort feel like more than a gesture. Yes, everything. Dawes exhaled through his nose from his place by the door. He had the blunt practicality of a man who has organized morning schedules for too many mornings in a row, and who has learned to regard anything that does not fit the schedule as an obstacle rather than a signal. "We are running a processing station," he said, "not a beauty salon." Helen turned and looked at him with an expression that required no volume to carry its full force. "No," she said, "we are running a medical facility, and this is now a medical issue." She was already thinking through the logistics before she finished the sentence, already converting the understanding of the situation into the practical inventory of what that understanding required. This was a specific skill that had made her useful in every facility she had worked in, the ability to move from seeing a problem clearly to addressing it without losing time in the space between, to treat insight as a beginning rather than an end. She went first to Pitts in the supply office, a young man with the careful self-importance of someone newly invested with administrative authority, and told him she needed 3 wash basins. He said he would need to log them as temporary reassignments. She told him to log whatever needed logging, and to have them at the laundry room in 45 minutes. She went to the surgical ward and Nurse Goodman, who was reading a letter from her sister over a piece of dry toast, pulled 2 bars of soap from the cabinet under the basin without looking up and without asking what for. Rough towels from the linen stores. Combs from the bag of donated women's items that had come in on a Red Cross shipment 3 months prior and had never been properly sorted because there was always something more urgent. Scissors, in case. 2 kettles from the kitchen, borrowed without announcing the borrowing because the kitchen staff were not yet at their posts and Helen did not have time to wait for permissions that would be granted anyway. The camp quartermaster stopped her in the corridor between the kitchen and the laundry room, the narrow passage that always smelled of old grease and recently extinguished lanterns. Hartley ran the supply operation with the defensive energy of a man who had decided that his particular domain was the last orderly thing in a universe of disorder and who guarded it accordingly. He looked at the 2 kettles and the crate of towels, and he asked what she was doing. She told him she was conducting a medical hygiene intervention for the new female detainees. He said that seemed like an unusual deployment of resources for enemy prisoners. She told him, in the even tone she used for things that were not negotiable, that under the applicable Geneva Convention provisions and the standing medical protocols of the facility, all persons in their care were entitled to basic hygiene provisions regardless of national origin or prisoner classification, that she was prepared to document every item used, and that the documentation was going to happen after the intervention was complete because she did not currently have the time to justify her medical decisions to people who had not been in the processing room 40 minutes ago when a girl barely old enough to have finished school whispered 2 words that had changed the nature of the entire morning. Hartley looked at her for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it took him to calculate whether he was going to win this. Then he stepped aside. The laundry room at the far end of the secondary building was not designed for what Helen was about to use it for. It was long and narrow with a concrete floor that had been worn smooth in the traffic patterns of whoever had used it before the military arrived and stamped their own patterns over the previous ones. A single window high on the east wall let in a column of pale autumn light that moved across the floor as the morning advanced. The permanent institutional smell of bleach and old steam lived in the walls and the ceiling and the floor in a way that smells live in places where the same things have been done in the same way for long enough to become atmospheric. But it had enough space, and space was the essential foundation of everything else she needed to create. Dolls appeared without being summoned and helped clear the room with the quiet efficiency of a man making a silent correction for the morning's earlier error. He and 2 orderlies moved equipment, stacked the flat items against the wall, dragged in wooden stools from the storage shed adjacent to the building. White sheets from the linen supply were strung on lengths of wire between 2 ceiling hooks, creating rough partitions, walls made of fabric. The suggestion of privacy in a room that had no architectural privacy to offer. It was not beautiful. It did not need to be beautiful. It needed to be warm and enclosed and to carry the promise, communicable without language, that within its walls a person would not be watched or mocked or judged, and those things were within Helen's power to provide. She sent Evelyn to bring the women through in her own time, without urgency, without the institutional pressure of people being processed according to a schedule. Then she stood in the center of the cleared room with the kettles and basins and soap and rough towels and a handful of combs, and she was still for a moment, not thinking about meaning, because thinking about meaning was for after, but breathing steadily in the room that smelled of bleach and hot water, and listening to the sounds outside the walls, the trucks on the camp road, the wind moving across the flat land, the ordinary operations of a military facility going about the morning's work. While in this room something different was about to happen, something that would not appear on any operational schedule and would be recorded, when it was recorded at all, in the flattest possible clinical language that would tell the factual truth and say almost nothing of the actual one. The women came through the door in a cluster, not in a line. They moved the way animals move in uncertain terrain, close together, each individual shielded by the other's proximity. The group's edges kept intact by the shared instinct that the group itself was safer than any one person within it. They stood at the threshold of the laundry room and looked at what Helen had assembled. The hanging white sheets and the basins and the stools and the steam rising from the kettles in pale wavering columns. And they did not move. The room was warmer than the processing hall, and they noticed that before anything else, the warmth arriving as an almost physical thing, something that pressed gently against the cold they had been carrying in their coats and their clothes and their skin. The smell was different too, less antiseptic, more domestic. Just a clean, uncomplicated smell of soap and hot water, the smell of a kitchen or a washroom in an ordinary house in an ordinary time. Helen watched their faces, still closed, still carrying the full accumulated weight of whatever they had arrived with that morning, the shame and the exhaustion, and the specific wariness of people who have learned that gentleness is usually the prelude to something else, still holding themselves with the defensive compression of women who have been living for months in spaces and situations that required constant defense of the most private and personal things they owned. She removed her gloves, slowly, in plain sight, pulling each finger loose and then peeling the glove from her hand with a movement that was deliberate enough to be visible to anyone watching and that communicated, without requiring words, that she was not about to do anything requiring protective equipment. She set them on the windowsill. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow. She picked up the first pitcher of warm water, and she walked directly to Lisa Bauer, and she placed a towel over her shoulders without hesitation, without the tentative quality that would have transformed the gesture into a question. The girl flinched. It was entirely instinctive, the deep muscle response of a body that has learned over a sufficient period of time that hands approaching it are unlikely to be bringing anything good. Helen felt the flinch under her hands and did not step back. She held the towel in place with one hand, and with the other she said, in German, as quietly and as steadily as she could manage, "You do not have to be afraid. No one here will mock you." The girl's lips parted. She looked at Helen with the specific expression of someone whose category system has just been confronted with information that does not fit any of its existing categories, and is trying to understand what to do with the surplus. Her name, in smeared pencil on a damp index card, was Lisa Bauer. She was 20 years old, which was both exactly her age and somehow not quite the right number for what was visible in her face, because faces in wartime are calibrated not by years alone, but by the density of experience, and certain months add more to a face than certain years do. She sat down. Helen poured the warm water slowly over the back of Lisa's head, tilting the pitcher with a careful controlled motion she used for all procedures that required steadiness, for all things that mattered enough to do precisely. The water ran dark immediately, darker within the first few seconds by the accumulated weeks, by the dust and grime of roads and vehicles and cramped sleeping spaces, and all the days during which no water had been available for anything except the most essential functions. It ran into the basin, in heavy streams of color of road water after rain. Lisa's hands moved to her lap and interlaced there, fingers pressing against fingers, knuckles white with the effort of remaining still, of not reaching up to interfere with what was happening, of allowing it. Helen began working the soap through her hair. She did not hurry. She had decided before she came into this room that she was going to take as long as necessary, that whatever time the work required was the time she would give it, and that any argument about the use of those minutes would happen afterward, and would be an argument she would prepare to have. She worked through the first hard compacted layer, and felt the hair begin to change under her fingers, felt the strands separating where they had been compressed together for weeks, felt the texture of the hair returning from something rigid and approximated to something that was actually hair again, with its own individual weight and quality and particular warmth of living hair when clean water runs through it. Lisa's shoulders began to shake. Evelyn reached for a towel, reading it as cold. Then she saw Lisa's face, and she understood, and she lowered the towel, and she said nothing, because that was the right thing to say. The tears came without sound. They fell straight down from Lisa's eyes along the line of her face, following the curve of her cheek and the angle of her jaw, falling from her chin into the fabric of her lap, without any of the gasping or the catching of breath that makes crying into a sound and a performance. These were tears that had been waiting for longer than Lisa had probably known they were waiting, that slipped out before the person producing them could make a considered decision about whether to allow them, that fell with the specific gravity of things that had been held in place well past their natural tenure. She sat completely still on the wooden stool with her white-knuckled hands in her lap, and she cried silently while an American nurse, whose existence in her life was a result of the most improbable chain of circumstances that she could have imagined a year ago, worked the grime of weeks out of her hair, as though the hair mattered, as though the person wearing it was someone whose hair was worth the attention of careful hands. The other women watched from across the room, all 14 of them, or rather 13, since Lisa was the first. Nobody looked away. Nobody spoke. Nobody made a sound. They stood near the doorway in their damaged coats, and they watched the girl sitting on a stool having her hair washed by an enemy nurse, and whatever was moving across their faces in those minutes was something that Helen would not have been able to name accurately in any language she possessed. Marta stood near the back with her arms crossed. Her eyes were bright. She was breathing very deliberately through her nose, the way a person breathes when they are managing something internal with great care and do not want it to become externally visible. Helen kept working. Rinse, soap, rinse again. She changed the water in the basin twice, each refill running slightly less dark than the previous one. By the time she began the final rinse, running clean water through hair that was now unmistakably and genuinely brown again, the warm earth brown that had been present the whole time underneath everything that covered it. Lisa had stopped crying, not because she had made a decision to stop, but because something had equalized. Some pressure had found its release, and the tears had ceased on their own in the quiet way that natural processes cease when they have completed their work. She sat in a different kind of stillness now, not the locked and sealed stillness she had carried to the camp gate that morning, the stillness of someone whose entire surface has been armored against contact, but something more open, the stillness of someone who has set something down after carrying it for a very long time, and is in the first few seconds of understanding what it feels like to have both hands free. Helen wrapped the hair in a clean towel and held it there for a moment. Then she stepped around to face Lisa, directly. She held out a comb. Lisa looked at the comb. Then she looked at Helen's face. Then she said one word. Why? It came out as less than a question and more than a statement, carrying in its single syllable the full impossibility of a situation, the entire architecture of the world that had produced this morning, the armies and the sides, and the long history of being taught that certain people were enemies and what enemies were permitted to expect from one another, and the specific impossibility of being an enemy, sitting on a stool, while the person on the other side of the enemy line untangled your hair with steady hands, and then offered you a comb with an expression that did not contain a single trace of anything other than the attentiveness that the moment required. Helen held her gaze. "Because you are human," she said, "and because it is time." The room broke open, not loudly, from the inside out, in the quietest possible way, along the lines that had always been the points of greatest pressure. The tall blonde woman at the back of the group, Ingrid, who had been standing with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her eyes carrying the hard, specific look of someone who has decided that scorn is the only form of dignity still reliably within her control. She uncrossed her arms. She walked forward with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is moving before they can reverse it. She sat down on the second stool without a word, and before Evelyn had properly draped the towel across her shoulders, she was crying, not silently the way Lisa had cried, but with great heaving, soundless sobs that came from somewhere so deep and had waited so long that they arrived with the force of things that had been compressed beyond their natural tolerance. Ingrid had not cried in 18 months. She would tell Helen this 2 days later, standing very straight, as she always stood, with the precise specificity of someone who has been keeping exact account. In February, she had made the decision that crying was not something she could afford, that she needed the resources it consumed for other purposes, and she had stopped at the grim efficiency of someone discontinuing a luxury that has become a liability. And then Helen Morris said 4 words in imperfect German to a girl on a wooden stool, and something opened in Ingrid that she had not realized she had sealed, and 18 months of what had not been cried came through at once. A red-haired girl with hollow cheekbones and a scar along her jaw that healed badly raised her hand. It was such a precise and incongruous classroom gesture in this specific context, in this laundry room in this prison camp in this autumn, a ruin war, that it took a moment for Helen to register it as a genuine request for attention rather than some kind of involuntary movement. The girl asked in a whisper whether they were allowed to keep the combs. Afterward, when they left, whether the combs were theirs or whether they would be collected, the way useful things were always eventually collected. One of the youngest, a girl who could not have been more than 16, with thin arms and hollow cheeks and a self-cut fringe that was badly uneven, and a general appearance of someone who had been trying to look after herself under conditions specifically designed to make self-care impossible, kept apologizing in rapid German for the state of her hair. She was sorry. She knew it was terrible. She was sorry. It had been so long. She was sorry. The apologies came faster and faster until Evelyn took both her hands in hers, firmly and without hesitation, and said, "Stop. We've seen worse. Sit still." The girl sat still, and when the warm water began to run through her hair, she closed her eyes and tilted her head back the smallest amount, the involuntary yielding of a body finally receiving something it has needed for a long time. Clara, who had been listed in the smeared paperwork as a radio operator attached to an administrative unit in the Eastern Sector, a designation that placed her nowhere precisely, was somewhere in her mid-20s, and had the particular appearance of someone who had been capable and organized before the collapse and who had spent the intervening months using all of her organizational capacity simply to survive. She sat for her wash with formality that was clearly the last available form of self-possession, her back very straight, her hands very still, accepting what was being done to her with the careful dignity of someone who has decided that accepting things gracefully is itself a form of resistance to the alternative. Partway through the rinse, a sound came from her that she clearly did not intend and could not stop, a long, slow exhalation that was not quite a sigh and not quite a sob, but occupied the exact acoustic space between them. And when it was done, she sat for a moment with her eyes closed and then opened them and said something to Marta in German. Marta translated. She says it smells like her mother's kitchen. The soap. She says she didn't know soap could still smell like that. Greta was older than the others. Perhaps 30, perhaps more, with hands that showed the particular wear of someone who had been doing physical work in difficult conditions for longer than the average. She watched the washing of 3 women before she moved forward and sat down, watching with the alert assessment of someone who needed to understand what a thing actually was before they trusted it. When the warm water finally ran through her hair, she kept her eyes open and tracked every movement Helen made and said nothing for a long time. Then she asked Marta, in a conversational tone that took some effort to maintain, whether the nurses had families. Marta translated. Helen said she had parents in Baltimore whom she had not seen in 14 months. Greta said, through Marta, that Helen's hands were very steady for someone so far from home. Helen said she had learned steadiness from the distance. Greta looked at her for a moment, and then she said, in German that Marta translated carefully, that steadiness from a distance is a harder thing than steadiness from nearness, and she respected it. Dawes appeared in the doorway at some point in the middle of the afternoon and stood there without announcing himself. He had his hands in his pockets, and his expression was doing the complicated interior work of a man who is revising something he thought he had accurately assessed and finding that the revision requires more of him than a simple correction of the data. He watched the room, without speaking, for several minutes. Then he disappeared. He came back 20 minutes later with extra soap, 2 additional bars, which he set on a table near the basins with a careful quietness, as though placing them too loudly would draw attention to the action and require him to account for it. He stood near the door after that, and he was quiet, and his presence in the room was different from what it had been in the morning, less impatient, more attentive in a way that did not call attention to itself. One of the younger orderlies, a boy from Georgia whose name Helen could never quite fix in her memory afterward despite the number of times she tried, brought a small brown bottle of scalp treatment from the infirmary, something for dryness and irritation, and handed it to Evelyn without explanation or annotation of any kind, as though he had simply identified a need and addressed it and did not require the act to be noted. Someone else brought hot tea in dented tin mugs, and these were passed to the women waiting their turns, and several of them wrapped both hands around the mugs and held them without immediately drinking, because the warmth was a provision being offered, and the warmth alone was what they needed in that moment. A woman named Clara, somewhere in her mid-20s, who had been listed as a radio operator in paperwork that placed her nowhere precisely, began to hum under her breath somewhere in the second hour, not a melody anyone present could identify, or if they could, they did not say so. Something recursive and quiet, a phrase of music repeated with small variations, the kind of humming that surfaces in a body, without conscious intention, that appears when a person is resting in a way they have not rested in a long time, and the body, recognized in condition, produces this particular sound the way it produces warmth or sleep. Nobody remarked on it. It simply lived in a room alongside the sound of water and the quiet rhythm of combs and the occasional exchange in German that Marta would attend to or leave alone according to the calibration that only a skilled translator achieves, the understanding of which silences contain questions and which contain answers. The hairpins arrived unexpectedly. Nobody had thought of hairpins. They were not on any supply list, and they did not belong to any category of medical provision, and there was no official justification for their presence. And yet someone, the exact identity of this person was never established to Helen's satisfaction, had located a crate of donated women's items that had arrived in a Red Cross shipment 3 months prior and had never been fully sorted. And inside that crate, among the miscellany of things that somebody somewhere had packed in the belief that women in difficult circumstances might need them, there were 3 paper-wrapped packets of hairpins. Cheap ones, slightly bent from the journey, the kind available for almost nothing in any ordinary shop, in any ordinary city, in any ordinary year. When Marta held up the packets and said in German that there were hairpins available if anyone wanted them, the sound that moved through the women was not a sound that could be adequately described in any report Helen would write afterward. It was not a gasp, and not quite a sigh, and not quite laughter, and not quite crying. It was a sound of people recognizing something they had not known they needed until the moment it was offered, all of them at once, in a room that had been holding only the sounds of water and quiet voices, and one recurring melody. One of the women asked for a mirror. There was no mirror in the laundry room, and no mirror easily sourced from anywhere nearby in the time available. Evelyn looked around the room for a moment with the particular expression of someone examining an engineering problem rather than a practical impossibility. Then she picked up a flat metal serving tray from the shelf by the door, one of the rectangular mesh trays that had apparently migrated from the kitchen at some earlier point in the facility's history, and she polished the back of it briskly with her sleeve until the metal surface caught the light from a high east window at an angle that was, if not reflective in any precise sense, at least responsive, at least capable of returning a general image of the person held before it. She held it up at face height and tilted it toward the nearest woman. The woman leaned forward and looked at herself in the dull and imprecise metal surface. And then she laughed. Not a polite laugh and not a careful qualified laugh, but a real one, sudden and completely unguarded, over before it fully sounded. The laugh of someone surprised by something unexpected in a moment when nothing unexpected was supposed to be possible. The next woman leaned forward to see too and laughed as well. Then a third, and then the laughter moved through the room the way weather moves, with its own momentum, unstoppable once begun, requiring nothing except the initial condition to propagate itself. For several long seconds, the laundry room of a prisoner of war facility in southern France on an October afternoon in the final year of the Second World War contained nothing but the sound of women laughing at a dull metal tray held up at arm's length by a nurse in a stained apron, and was the most straightforward and uncomplicated sound a room had produced all day, and it was the most necessary. Helen stood in the middle of it with wet hands and something in her throat she would not attempt to document. By late afternoon, the kettles were cold, and the basins had been emptied and refilled, and emptied again for the last time, and the floor of the laundry room was wet in the irregular patterns that traced the course of an afternoon's work, and the white sheets hung damp at the edges where steam had condensed, and the crate of towels held only a few remaining at the bottom, and the combs had been distributed among the women, and the hairpins were gone, divided carefully and slipped into pockets, and the turned hems of coats with methodical precision of people who have learned not to trust that useful things remain available once they have been released from their immediate context. Helen stood in the center of what the room had been for the last several hours, and she looked at all of it, the wet floor and the damp sheets and the empty kettle and the depleted towel crate, and she let herself feel, briefly and completely, everything that the afternoon had contained. Then she went through to the processing hall. The 14 sets of clean clothes were still on the tables, still folded, still in their careful rows, waiting exactly where they had been since before dawn with the patient reliability of objects that do not have opinions about whether they are used or not. The room was the same cold room, but the nature of a room is determined not only by its walls and its floor and its contents, but by the people who are about to move through it. And the people who were about to take the clean clothes from these tables were not the same people who had stood beside those tables that morning and could not reach out and touch them. The women came through one at a time. Each one crossed the threshold differently than she had crossed it in the morning. The crossing was slightly larger now, slightly less compressed, slightly less sealed against the possibility of reception. The clothes were taken from the tables with both hands, held for a moment, and then carried behind the white sheet partitions that had been set up along the far wall. When the women emerged, they were wearing the plain cotton dresses, and the dresses fit them perfectly and were not beautiful, and said nothing about who any of these women had been before the war rearranged every fact about their lives. But they were clean, and the women wearing them were clean, and the alignment between the outside and the inside, however provisional, however partial, however far from the full restoration of everything that had been taken, was enough to make the impossible contradiction bearable. The lie was no longer a lie. The outside and the inside matched, within the range of what was currently achievable, and that range was enough for a person standing without feeling like a fraud. Lisa was the last to come through. She came through the partition wearing the plain blue dress and the shoes that were half a size too large, and she walked with the careful attention of someone navigating new terrain, not unfamiliar terrain, because she knew how to walk, but terrain that had been recently altered in a way that required relearning. Her hair was dry and fell soft to her shoulders, genuinely brown, warm and light, and her face, still thin, still carrying the visible record of the months behind her in the shadows under her eyes, and particular compression around her mouth that comes from holding things in for a long time, had released the rigid armored expression it had worn since the truck door opened. In its place was something more uncertain and more open, the expression of someone who has been very far from themselves for a very long time and is in the first cautious stages of finding their way back, not arriving, not restored, but moving. She touched her hair with her fingertips. Just briefly, a light touch at the side of it. "It feels light," she said. "That is usually how clean hair works," Helen said. Lisa gave a small laugh, surprised out of her, gone before it was fully present. She stood in the processing room in the two large shoes, and she looked at Helen for a quiet moment. Then she said the thing she had been moving toward all afternoon, the thing that had been forming in her since the moment she sat down on the wooden stool and the warm water ran over the back of her head, and something inside her that had been clenched for months began, very quietly, to loosen. In the trucks, she said, we stopped speaking about the future. None of us wanted to say the words that belong to normal people. She paused. Her voice in the pause was doing something complicated, balancing between grief and what was not quite its opposite but was the nearest available thing. Washing. She touched her hair again, the same light touch. This feels like maybe tomorrow exists again. Helen did not answer immediately, because there was no answer that was adequate to what had just been said, no response that would not reduce it by attempting to match it. She stood in the cold processing room, and she looked at Lisa Bauer touching her own clean hair and saying the word tomorrow, like it was a country she had stopped believing she would ever see again. And she felt the full weight of the afternoon settle into her, and she knew she would carry forward all of it into everything that came after. That night she wrote the camp log in the clinical language that official records required, recording that a sanitation and hygiene intervention had been completed for 14 female detainees, that cooperation had improved, that distress had been reduced, that fresh clothing had been accepted following hair washing and basic personal care provision, and that there had been no disciplinary incidents. She read it back twice. It was accurate. Every word of it was accurate in the narrowest possible sense of accuracy, the sense that includes what happened and excludes what the happening meant. She closed the log. Then she opened the small private notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her jacket, the notebook she had carried since Baltimore, and that had accumulated for years of things that did not fit into official documentation, and she wrote for a long time by the light of the single lamp in the officers' quarters while outside the camp went about its evening routines, the change of guard and the mess hall sounds and the trucks on the road beyond the fence. She wrote about 2 words whispered in a cold room by a girl who was 20 years old and carrying 18 months of retreat in her hair. She wrote about white knuckles pressed together in a lap. She wrote about Ingrid's arms uncrossing and what that had looked like from across the room. She wrote about the hairpins and the polished tray and the unexpected laughter that had filled the room and lasted only a few seconds and changed everything about the room's atmosphere for the rest of the afternoon. She wrote about Clara humming. She wrote about Greta talking about steadiness. She wrote about the youngest girl stopping her apologies and closing her eyes. She wrote about Lisa saying the word tomorrow. From the barracks where the women had been housed came nothing. No sound of pacing. No voices through 2 sets of walls. No movement detectable through the thin floors and the thin walls of a temporary military facility. Just silence. And inside that silence, in the building across the compound, 14 women sleeping. Actually sleeping with the completeness of people who have set something down that they have been carrying for so long that the relief of setting it down is enough to carry them into sleep before anything else can intervene. Helen listened to that silence for a long time. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed and slept herself. The next morning, the change was visible before anyone had to think about it or name it or find language for what had shifted. The women came into the mess hall for breakfast with combed hair. not styled, not arranged in any way that suggested anything beyond the basic private act of comb drawn through hair with attention and intention. Some had cut their hair months earlier, and the shortness showed, rough and uneven at the edges. Some still had lengths that were unequal and ends that were damaged. Several wore their hair pinned with the cheap, slightly bent pins from the donated parcel, the pins doing their practical work of keeping things in place without making any claims beyond the functional. But the hair was combed. Every one of the 14 had combed their hair before breakfast in a barracks with no mirrors and insufficient light, simply because the comb was theirs now, and combing their hair was something they had the right to do, and they were going to do it. They sat straighter at the breakfast tables. They thanked the kitchen staff in quiet German when trays were passed across the counter. They ate with less of the anxious, rapid quality that comes from not trusting that the food will continue to be present if you slow down. One of them asked through Marta whether there was work available in the laundry room, since the nurses had already done so much there, and she would like to contribute something that went in the other direction. Dawes heard this from his position near the door and stood for a moment looking at the tables, at the combed hair and the straighter backs, and the quiet exchanges that Marta was brokering across the language gap, all of it so different from the closed and sealed silence of the processing room the morning before. He said something under his breath to Helen, beside him. I guess it wasn't about clothes after all. No, Helen said. It wasn't. On the second afternoon, Ingrid came to find her. She stood very straight, as she always stood, and she spoke to Marta, and Marta translated. She said that she wanted Helen to know that she had not cried in 18 months, that in February she had made the calculation that crying was not something she could afford to do, that it consumed resources she needed for other purposes, and she had stopped it with the bleak efficiency of someone canceling an expenditure that has become unsustainable. She said that when Helen said the words, "because you are human," they had arrived somewhere inside her that she had not thought to guard, somewhere she had not realized was unguarded, and she had not been able to stop what happened. She said she was not apologizing for what happened. She was explaining it, because she wanted Helen to understand that it was not weakness, and it was not performance. It was 18 months arriving at once, because a door had opened that she had thought was sealed. Marta translated this carefully and completely. Helen listened. Then she said, through Marta, that she was glad the door had opened, and that she did not for a moment consider what had happened to be weakness. Ingrid looked at her steadily. Then she said something else, and Marta translated it with the particular care of someone conveying something that the speaker has chosen with great precision. She said, I want to know your name, because I want to remember the name of the person who reminded me that I was still the kind of person who could cry, after 18 months of being something else. Helen told her. Ingrid repeated it, once precisely, with the attention of someone committing something to reliable memory. Then she gave a single formal nod and walked back across the room. The third morning came earlier than expected, driven by a transfer order that arrived on its own schedule without apology or ceremony. The trucks pulled to the gate in the dark, engines coughing in cold air, headlights moving across the compound in sweeping arcs. The women were given 20 minutes to gather their things, which was enough time because what they had to gather was not much. And then they came out of the barracks in the pre-dawn darkness with their bags in front of them, and their collars turned up against the cold, and their faces carrying a particular expression of people who have learned not to invest too much in destinations because destinations change. Helen stood at the edge of the convoy path with Evelyn beside her and the camp log under her arm. A guard moved along the forming line, checking names against a printed list. Engines ran. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence a bird called once into the darkness and then went quiet. The sky in the east was beginning its slow, reluctant move from black toward the pale silver that precedes actual dawn. Lisa stepped out of the line when the guard passed her and moved across the gravel toward Helen. A guard started to move, and Helen raised one hand, and he stopped. Lisa came across with something held in both hands, small and wrapped in a piece of cloth, carried with the deliberateness of something that has been decided in advance, that is the product of thought rather than impulse. She unwrapped it. The wooden comb. She held it out. Helen said no. Keep it. Lisa shook her head once, with a certainty that was entirely quiet and entirely unargumentable. For the next girl, she said, maybe she will think she is beyond cleaning, too. Helen took the comb. The wood was smooth from the 3 days of use and faintly warm from Lisa's hands. She closed her fingers around it and stood in the pre-dawn cold of a prison camp in southern France while the trucks idled and the guards worked through their lists and the pale silver edge of the eastern sky grew very slowly lighter, and she held the comb and she understood, without requiring it to be said, everything that the giving of it contained. Lisa stood straighter. She met Helen's eyes directly and steadily, the way she had not been able to meet them when she stepped down from the truck 3 mornings earlier. Her own eyes were present and clear. She said something in English, very careful English, the kind assembled from classroom instruction years before the war arrived and broke the world into its current shape, chosen because the care of construction was itself part of what she wanted to convey, because easy words would not carry the weight she needed this to carry. "Thank you," she said, for not looking away. The truck door closed. The convoy moved through the gate and onto the road between the fields and became a sound and then became a smaller sound and then became nothing. Helen stood in the vacant space where the trucks had been and held the comb in her closed hand. After a while, Evelyn said, "You're going to keep that, aren't you?" "Yes," Helen said, "not as a souvenir." "No." She kept it for 34 years, in the back of her desk drawer in Baltimore. Through 3 hospitals and 2 houses and the long middle decades when the war receded into something that happened in books and films, and the annual ceremonies that fewer people attended each year. Her husband, George, a secondary school history teacher who understood the difference between things kept as trophies and things kept as reminders, never asked about it. He simply understood. When Helen died at 68, he found the comb and kept it in his own desk for 11 years more. When he died, his daughter found it there with a small card in George's handwriting, 3 sentences explaining where it had come from and what it had meant, which was enough. Helen had never needed to write those sentences herself because she had always known exactly what the comb was for, not a monument to anything she had done, a reminder of something simple, that sometimes the first step in returning people to themselves is not a speech or a treaty or even freedom. Sometimes it is warm water, steady hands, and the decision, made clearly and without hesitation, to treat the broken as though they still belong to the world. Because they do. They always have. And sometimes the only unthinkable thing about that is how much it changes a room when someone finally acts like it is true.